Welcome everybody to this evening's fall feeding webinar. We've got a whole slew of different topics that we're going to discuss tonight. When Tiffany and I were talking about, well, what's going to be happening at that time of the year? Well, we're talking about weaning and feeding seniors, thinking about what hay should we be trying to stockpile or look into for going through the winter months. And of course, if you have any questions at all, feel free to ask them. As Tiffany said in the chat box, Dr. Duran is on as well, and he will be able to answer questions in the chat box, or at the end, we'll open it up to questions. So I always like to set the stage, and we'll do a real brief overview of digestive function, because I think that a basic understanding of digestive function sets the stage for issues that can come up with weaning, with senior horses, and then of course why forage is really the cornerstone to feeding horses. If we start with the horse's teeth, the bottom jaw chews in a circular motion, so it's really important that we're having correct dental wear. And research has shown that when horses are out in a field and they're constantly grazing, and if we use that wild horse or horse that's out grazing continually as kind of the gold standard of what is a normal horse, they will chew about 60,000 times. So that bottom jaw will sweep across about 60,000 times. If we put him in a stall and we feed him what we would consider a normal amount of hay, about 15 to 20 pounds of hay and anywhere from 6 to 12 pounds of grain, all of that combined, he's only going to chew about 30,000 times. So just by putting a horse in a stall and feeding him hay and grain, we're already significantly cutting down on the amount of chews. Next, we move to the esophagus of the horse, the throat. And this is, in people, your windpipe and your esophagus are the same. So if I was choking on my food, I would also not be able to breathe. They're two separate pipes in the horse. And so when a horse chokes, they can still breathe, but they'll be constantly coughing and straining to try and dislodge whatever is stuck in its throat. And really anything can get stuck in a horse's throat. It's a muscular tube. And there's really no way of training that muscular tube to get stronger. Saliva is produced in the mouth, and the first part of what that saliva does is it lubricates the throat to help that food slide down the esophagus. But if a horse eats too quickly and they put too much food and they try to swallow too much food, then it's going to get stuck in the throat and cause choke. And it really can happen with any type of food that you provide to a horse. It's more likely to happen if a horse has choked in the past. There might be some scar tissue there, and so it will increase your horse's risk for choke. Any horses that eat really quickly or bolt their food, new horses to the facility, bottom of the pecking order, these horses are all at much higher risk of choking than others. There's things that you can do. We recommend that you put the feed bucket closer to the ground, because that stimulates more chewing, therefore more saliva. You can put a big brick in the feed tub to slow them down. Feed hay first. Feed enough hay continually so that the horse is not hungry, so that they won't be bolting their food. So as I mentioned, saliva is a buffer. If we take that 2 pounds of any kind of grain concentrate and we put it in a tub on the ground, the horse will chew about 1,000 times. If we take that same 2 pounds of hay and we put it on the ground, he'll chew about 2,000 times, because long stem hay, it takes a lot longer, a lot more sweeps to chew that. And so therefore it's producing more saliva. 2 pounds of grain concentrate, if we feed it in the typical position that we all do in a stall and we hang a bucket on the wall, they're only going to chew that between 350 to 500 times. So you can see that we're significantly decreasing the amount of saliva by hanging buckets higher. Saliva, number one, I mentioned it's going to lubricate the esophagus so that we can swallow food, but it also buffers stomach acid. One of the biggest problems we see in horses today our domestic horses, is gastric ulcers, and it's 100% man-made. So if we quickly go through the rest of the digestive tract, I know we've got a lot to get through. You'll see this graphic several times. The stomach is really small in relation to the rest of the digestive system. It's full of acid that is going to break down the food. If I cut a window in the stomach and let you look inside, there are two distinct regions. The top section, which I call the non-protected region, and the bottom section, that dark pink tissue, which I call the protected region. And it's protected by this slippery, slimy mucus coating. And what is it protecting from? So there are cells in the bottom part of the stomach that continually secrete acid, and that acid is there to break down food. But unlike a dog or a cat that have a meal response, so they sense, smell, see food, and then they'll start to secrete acid as a meal response, the horse doesn't have that. They're continually secreting acid. And that's why we want to be continually allowing them something to chew on, mimicking that grazing behavior when we put them in stalls, because that acid production is in place for a horse that is continually grazing. They're continually chewing, they're continually swallowing saliva, continually diluting that stomach acid. If we move then to the small intestine, it's like a big long garden hose. If you lay it out, it's about 70 feet in length. There are enzymes here in the small intestine that break down food. Unlike in the stomach where we have the acid, here we now have enzymatic digestion. There's a particular enzyme called amylase, and we know that it's responsible for breaking down starch, but we also know that there's only a certain amount of it in the small intestine at any given time. There's not bucket loads of amylase. And so there are certain rules that we say about feeding horses. Don't feed large meals, large grain meals, and that's because the stomach is really small. And make sure that you're feeding processed grains to your horses as well. We don't want to feed a lot of whole grains to horses, whole corn, whole barley, because that amylase is just not able to break down those starch molecules. So we want to make sure, unlike in human nutrition where we are getting bombarded with how we should be eating whole foods and a whole grain diet, and we try to apply that to our horses, and it really just doesn't work. Horses aren't really designed to eat a lot of grain, period, but we have to get them to eat grain because we need them to maintain energy levels and body weight. So we need to make it safer for them. So we're going to process those grains, add other digestive aids like live cell yeast that are going to help break down and maintain good quality bacteria as well. From here on back, this is the hindgut of the horse. It starts with the CECUM. The CECUM is a blind sac. It's like a balloon. So it's easy for gas to get stuck in here, things to build up here, because the entry and exit point are the same portal. From here on back, we have bacterial or microbial fermentation that's continuing to break down the food. And all of this whole region, its primary ingredient that it should be breaking down is fiber. If we move to the large colon, I've got it highlighted here in blue. It twists and turns. You can see the rate of passage to get through this section of the digestive system is significantly longer than the stomach or the small intestine. The stomach, it can be as little as 30 minutes to get through the stomach, up to 4 hours to get through the small intestine. And now we're looking at 35 hours and upwards to get through the large colon. When those bacteria are breaking down the fiber, one of the byproducts they create is heat. So as we go into the cooler months and we think about ways that we can keep our horses warm, one of the simplest things you can do is provide plenty of fiber, plenty of hay, and it really doesn't have to be the most leafy, stemmy, digestible hay. Actually, if it's a little more stemmy, then the harder those bacteria work to break down that fiber, the more heat that they will create. In the small colon, we're just really absorbing moisture out of the non-digested food particles and forming fecal balls. If we're seeing excess water in the manure, diarrhea, or fecal water syndrome, then we can be pretty rest assured that there's something going on in the hindgut of the horse, that they're not able to absorb that moisture. So we had a very brief overview of the digestive system. One of the other topics that we discussed that would be going on this time of year is weaning young foals. And we wanted to chat about some things, different types of weaning, what might be stressing horses during weaning, and some key elements that we should take into account when we're weaning. What is weaning? At the very basic, it is a separation of the mare from that nursing foal. It breaks that nursing bond. So then that foal needs to go from replacing the nutrients that they may be getting from milk to its own food. And so we need to make sure that that foal is fully adjusted to any grain concentrate or supplement that they're going to get prior to weaning. And after weaning, then our goal is that that mare quits producing milk and she can go back to doing, whether she's going to continue to get rebred, she's going to go off to be a riding horse, whatever, you can take her to be her own entity. I often get asked, what is the ideal weaning age? And there's a pretty wide spread. But if you think about the lactation curve of the mare really drops off after 3 months. And the fetal liver stores of minerals, copper and zinc that are during the last part of pregnancy, that mare will fortify the fetal liver with these minerals, because mare's milk is really not that high in mineral content. We're getting calories and protein out of it. And so by about 3 months of age, all of those minerals that were stored in that foal's liver are also depleted. So that's when in the wild that foal would have been consistently eating pasture, grasses on its own. So really you can nutritionally wean them anytime after 3 months of age. It's more typical that foals are weaned about 5 to 6 months of age. The earlier you wean them, obviously they're not getting the socialization and the manners and the that kind of thing from the mother. But there are cases where the mare nutritionally, she's not able to manage that foal. I'm working with a case right now where the mare is on stall rest, so we're going to wean that foal early so that it can go off with another herd of horses and have a normal life while the mare is in stall rest. The mare, she'll continue producing small quantities of milk through 8 to 9 months, but as I mentioned, the lactation curve really drops off right around 3 months of age. What do you need to do before you get into weaning? What do you need to do? Well, you want to make sure that you've got a strong, healthy foal, and you want to make sure that anything that might stress that foal, vaccinations, deworming, trimming the feet, all of those things are taken care of so that once you wean the foal, we can put as little stress on them as possible. What things can we do to decrease weaning stress? Well, depending on the size of your facility, if you've only got one foal, then the social aspect of keeping the foal with the same herd mates really doesn't apply. But if you've got several foals that you're weaning, you might have a bit of a spread in age, but it's best to wean them all at the same time so that you can keep them all together. Move the mares away, not the foals, again, so we're not moving the foal to a new environment. Maintain you've developed a routine of visit, going out, your schedule of contact with those animals, and maintain that schedule through after weaning. And nutrition, as I mentioned, whatever you're going to feed the foals post-weaning, they must be adapted to it and eating the full ration and comfortable with it prior to weaning, so that's just one less thing that we're going to change. Things that can occur if we don't take a lot of proactive measures and they suffer from a lot of stress. We'll see them lose weight. they don't want to eat. They might have get a lowered immune system if they're not eating, behavioral issues, sometimes they get aggressive. But one of the big things that we have to be cautious of is kind of troughs and valleys in growth. We want to, when young growing horses, you want to have a nice clean growth curve that doesn't have big blips in it. And so if we had a lot of weaning stress, then we would see a lot of slow growth. And then as they started to come out of that, we might see a rapid growth phase, and that could be detrimental to their growth. There are different methods. There's two basic methods, gradual and abrupt. I think most of us are most familiar with that abrupt method, where you just take the mares away. But it really depends on the number of foals you have, the amount of people you have help on your farm, and the size of your farm. It's great if you can take the mares, 5 miles away, so that your foals don't ever hear them. But if you've just got a small farm, that's just not practical. So gradual weaning, mares and foals are separated and reunited several times a day. This is probably one of the methods that we're less familiar with. Eventually, the mare and foal are kept in an area where they can see each other, they can hear each other, but they're separated. And so some people will call it fence line weaning. They're on opposite sides of the fence, and it just excludes the nursing, but they still have that social interaction. It's used more commonly on smaller operations where we don't have a lot of foals. Maybe we've got one or two, and we can do this. It's labor intensive because we're taking the mare away for a few hours here and a few more hours, and we're gradually building it up. It's very labor intensive. You're not going to see this on the larger farms. Larger quarter horse or thoroughbred farms just aren't going to do this. Obviously you have to make sure that the fences are very safe, whatever the barrier between the mare and foal, because at the beginning, obviously, the foal can be a little stressed. Abrupt weaning, what we're more familiar with, we're completely separating them. You're taking the mare to a completely different part of the farm. And as I mentioned, if you have a small farm, taking away the visual contact, you may be able to do that, but we can all still hear them screaming, and that really stresses out those mares and foals. So on the larger operations, maybe they have multiple facilities, or they just have a really large area, they can move them away, and we're taking them completely away from the nursing aspect, the visual, and they can't hear them. To minimize stress, because this is probably the one that can cause the most stress, is, again, you're going to take the mare away and keep the foal in the same paddock. And this is going to happen in facilities where we're weaning large quantities of foals at the same time. So we're keeping all those foals together, so they cling together with their herd mates, and that can decrease stress. And again, we're always maintaining the same routine. Horses are routine animals. Even when they're adults, if you're late to get out there to feed them in the afternoon, they are pouring, they're kicking. They know that you come at 5 o'clock every day, and if you don't come till 5:15, they are cranky. And we can decrease stress in those young babies if we set up a routine prior to weaning, and we maintain that routine throughout weaning, and obviously the feeding as well. Pasture weaning as one of the types of abrupt weaning, where you can actually have a large group of mares and foals, and the older ones, you'll take the older foals mares out at first, remove a few mares, wait a few more days, remove a few more mares, wait a few more days, remove a few more mares. That can decrease stress as well. But again, it's a little bit more labor intensive than just taking all the mares out at once. More common in larger facilities where there is a lot of help, and we can keep those babies together. Sometimes they'll even leave a gelding or a non-nursing mare in the field just to be their buddy, kind of the den master of the foals. You can do the same thing, but using stalls. So you'll put the mares and foals in the stalls, and then you leave the foals in the stalls, take the mares completely away, one foal per stall. And this is really good if you've got people, and you can then get in there and be handling the foals to decrease the stress, and then slowly start to turn them out as well. Again, it all depends on the facilities that you have. If you have 10 foals that you want to wean, do you have 10 stalls that you can put them in? It's not necessarily new research, but there's research to suggest that there's been research looking at music in all different stressful scenarios in horses, whether it's a competitive barn, whether it's, riding horses. But this particular study looked at weaning stress, and if you play music in the barn, can it decrease their stress? And they measured heart rate, and certain types of music can certainly decrease heart rate. I've looked at other research studies where they showed radio versus opera music versus rock music, and whether that changed the heart rate on performance horses in a barn. And I think the radio was better, just the calm voices versus music, but that's just a little bit of interesting. So we'll switch gears because I know not everybody has foals, so that's kind of a pretty niche market there. But I think more and more of us have been exposed to senior horses and feeding, whether it's your own senior horse or somebody else in the barn has an older horse. And we really can break down old horses into 4 categories. We've got older horses that are healthy and active, and if I came to your farm, I would look at him and say, he looks great. How old is he? Because it would be very hard for me to tell that he was older. He's got plenty of good teeth, and so he can really continue to eat anything. You can have these older horses that are very easy keepers. Well, that's just as long as he's got good teeth, that horse needs to be on a diet, just like any other easy keeper. Then we get into what is more typical of these older horses. You may have a horse that's a harder keeper, but as long as he still has good dentition, again, really what you'll find as we go through these older horse criteria, to me, when it comes to nutritionally senior, it's all about the teeth. If he's got good teeth, he can eat anything. If he can still eat hay, then he can eat any feed available. If he's thin, feed him a high-fat, high-fiber feed. But if he doesn't have great teeth, if he's got poor teeth, then that's where we need to employ senior feeds that are. He can't chew hay, so we need to put all that fiber into the bag, and he's going to be eating large quantities of it to get his fiber requirements. Oftentimes, these horses are also the ones that have metabolic issues. Maybe they've got Cushing's disease. We know that older horses decrease their insulin sensitivity, so they've got other special veterinary and dietary needs that most likely can all be met using a true senior feed. So, as I mentioned, my definition, the nutritional definition of a senior, really has no age attached to it. I have had 22-year-old horses that have barely any teeth, and they've had a hard life, and they need to be on a strict senior type diet that we're wetting. And then I've had 36-year-old ponies that are still bucking kids off and have plenty of teeth and eat a balance or pellet and hay, and they do just fine. So true nutritional senior horse has poor dentition, poor teeth, and they can't eat that normal food, they can't eat that hay and maintain their body condition. If you can't grind and eat that food, there's decreased fiber digestion, so there's going to be hindgut issues. Most of these older horses get loose manure or diarrhea, not digesting that fiber very well, decreased protein digestion, decreased phosphorus digestion. And we know that older horses, just in general, this isn't just if you have poor teeth, but older horses in general, post 20, decrease their insulin sensitivity. Now, they don't go into full-blown insulin resistance every single time, but we know that they are more likely to develop other metabolic issues because they decrease their insulin sensitivity. So when we design true senior feeds, we should be feeding lower carbohydrate feeds to older horses. What are some of the things that we need to do with these senior horses? Well, soak the feed because they have poor teeth and they really oftentimes need a mash that they can almost drink. So we can't feed them hay, so we're going to soak maybe a forage pellet, or we're going to feed a senior feed that is a true complete feed. And when I use that term correctly, it means you don't have to feed additional hay. So it's everything that the horse needs, including fiber right there in that feed. But you'll find that the feeding rate on a real senior feed is high. It's 10 to 15 pounds because we're looking at that horse getting 1 to 1.5% of his body weight in fiber. So we need to feed him a lot of fiber in that grain. Low sugars and starches, because as I mentioned, their insulin sensitivity is just decreased. So what are we putting in senior feeds? Well, we've got really good quality protein sources. We're going to use digestive aids like yeast culture because that's going to help break down fiber in the hindgut. And on top of that, we're using really high quality fiber sources, so soy hulls and beet pulp, things that are more digestible than your normal hay, maybe adding more bioavailable sources of phosphorus as well. So if we look at the senior low carb, the LMF senior low carb, we're listing the sugar and starch values on the tag because it's really important that if we're proclaiming a low carb feed that clients and customers can see those values. Ideal for horses that need that low carb product due to these metabolic issues. Can't chew hay. It can be fed as a complete feed or with hay. And it has glucosamine. It's a 13% protein, 8% fat, 10% non-structural carbohydrates. As I mentioned, there was research that showed that these older horses just decrease their insulin sensitivity. That was research done out of the University of Kentucky. If you need additional calories for additional weight gain, you can add additional oil if you need. This is a higher fat feed, so typically when you're feeding it as a complete feed, you wouldn't need to add additional oil, but it's also got 100% natural vitamin E, and it's a higher value than most other feeds. Vitamin E is an antioxidant. It helps with insulin sensitivity. It helps with immune function. Overall, it's really ideal for these older horses, and a lot of them are not on pasture. And where do horses get vitamin E? They get it from fresh green pasture, and just the majority of our horses aren't eating enough fresh green grass because we're managing them in stalls or smaller pastures, and they're not turned out 24/7. So the additional vitamin E is really critical in an older horse feed. But really, the crux of feeding any horse, whether you're weaning them, whether you're feeding a senior horse, whether you're feeding a performance horse or your backyard pleasure horse, is forage. It's the most important part of the horse's diet. The only reason that we feed anything else is to complement what we may or may not be getting out of forage. So what does that mean? So absolute bare minimum would be amount that you would have to feed your horse in forage hay would be 1% of their body weight in dry matter. Now, if you have a lot of pasture in the spring and the fall, we have those cool season grasses come on, and they're higher grasses, about 80% moisture. So to get that at minimum 1% of body weight in dry forage, the horse has to eat a considerable amount of pasture. So oftentimes when my clients say, I have plenty of pasture, my horses are getting everything, all of the calories and protein they need out of the pasture, we really have to have a good evaluation of, do you have 2 acres per horse, and does that 2 acres have about 75% coverage, because if you have less than that, then chances are your horses aren't getting the amount of dry matter that they need. If I have a fat horse and I want to put it on a weight loss program, I will feed about 1.2% of their body weight in hay per day. That horse probably won't be grazing and consuming whatever they want. So we're looking at about, for that 1,000-pound horse, about 12 pounds of fiber per day. And that seems very limited, and it is. So I think I want to flip-flop the terms. An easy keeper, that is actually really a hard horse to feed. A hard keeper or a thin horse, that's pretty easy. You just keep feeding it. But the easy keeper is a really hard horse for us to manage, because we've now got to feed a restricted diet, but in a manner that is mimicking that grazing behavior. So we don't just trade one problem for another. We don't trade his obesity for gastric ulcers and stereotypical behavior because we didn't let him eat anything. Typically, though, I'm going to recommend that horses eat between 1.5 to 2.5% of their body weight when they're reliant on just hay. You're looking at that 15 to 25 pounds of hay per day. You know, they're really not going to eat more than 30, 35 pounds, 3 to 3.5% of their body weight per day. They really max out at that much. So that gets to hay. And the question was raised, well, how do we choose the right hay for a horse? Well, in order to choose the right hay for a horse, we have to understand a little bit about hays and what they're going to bring to the table. And then you have to have a good hard look at what your horse requires and match the two up. Sometimes that's difficult in a boarding stable. Maybe you've got a really thin horse that needs a lot more nutrition out of the hay, and the stable that you are at has a low nutritional value hay. But there's ways around that. So what determines nutritional content of the hay? Stage of maturity. When it's really young, it's low in the non-digestible fiber. Non-digestible fiber fractions, as the plant gets taller and taller and taller, it's the skeleton that holds it up. It's what allows the plant to continue to grow taller and not flop over. But unfortunately, that fiber that is the skeleton, it's non-digestible. So the bigger the plant is, the less digestible it is. So that will decrease the nutrient content. When it's cut, obviously, factors into that stage of maturity. And then also, if you cut early in the morning, which is not practical because a lot of times we have too much moisture on the ground. But if you cut early in the morning, we're typically going to have lower sugars and starches, because overnight those plants have utilized all those carbohydrates, and by first thing in the morning we're depleted. But oftentimes we cut midday to the afternoon because it's drier. Growing conditions will affect it. The plant's not going to have a lot of nutritional value if the soil was really poor. It's just not going to grow very well. If it is in a drought, it's not going to grow. It'll store a lot of carbohydrates. And then obviously your drying conditions. Out here on the East Coast where I live, it's very difficult to get multiple cuttings of hay because it's always raining. They're using different techniques to try and dry the hay. But in the West, where the best hay comes from, you know, it's pretty dry conditions anyway. So you can dry that hay pretty much as you cut it, dries. It doesn't continue to degrade. Type of hay. Alfalfa is a legume. It's high in good quality protein, also usually pretty high in calories, versus your grass hays can be all over the shop. We can have really poor local grass hays that are really low in protein and energy, up to really high quality grass hays. So within grass, there is a lot of variation. When you evaluate hay, you can visually evaluate it, but you can also do an analysis. When you visually evaluate the hay, there's only a certain few things that you can tell. You know, you can look at the leaf to stem ratio, and that can give you a bit of an idea of the maturity. And so we mentioned that the more mature it is, the less digestible it probably will be. But that's not a bad thing, again, when we get to what is appropriate for my horse. As it loses color, it doesn't necessarily lose all of its nutritional value. Bleached hay will definitely have lost its vitamins A and E, but that happens pretty quickly anyway. When the green has lost its vitamin A and vitamin E, but it's not necessarily going to be losing its protein or energy or copper content. That's what we can get out of it visually. We can also assess whether there's weeds in it, whether it's dusty, moldy. That's our visual assessment. Past that, you need to have a laboratory analysis of your hay to further evaluate protein and energy and mineral status. There's no way you can look at your hay and decide and tell me the copper content, for example. When I look at a hay test, though, there are certain things that stick out to me. Number one, I always look at the moisture content, because if it's got too much moisture in it, I worry about it getting moldy. And we've all heard the kind of worst case scenario of hay getting warm, being damp when it was put up, and slightly damp when it was put up, and it got really warm, because it's those anaerobic bacteria that live in the hindgut. Remember, we were talking about those bacteria that live in the hindgut in that oxygen-free environment create heat. The exact same thing can happen in this bale of hay, and if it's baled slightly damp, then it can actually go on fire. When I'm looking at the first variables I look at, other than the moisture content, is I look at the fiber fractions. That's going to give me a lot of information about, number one, is the horse is going to eat it? Is it going to be palatable? And if they do eat it, what are they actually going to get out of it? Is it going to be that digestible? So ADF, acid detergent fiber, if this value on a dry matter basis exceeds about 45%, or on as-fed basis, which is we haven't dried it all out, 38%, that means the hay is going to be pretty poorly digested. ADF is, for me, the simplest way to describe it is a measure of digestibility. NDF, or neutral detergent fiber, if these values get high, say higher than, say, 55% on a dry matter basis, or 47% around there on an as-fed basis, it's going to have pretty low palatability. They won't like it very much. So oftentimes someone will say to me, oh, my horses really don't like first cutting hay. They don't like this hay. I can pretty much say, well, it's going to have a high NDF value. But again, that's not always a bad thing. Let's just say we have that fat little pony in the barn that is an air fern. A hay that's got a higher NDF that isn't going to be that palatable, but it's just something for him to chew on and he's not going to gorge on it, may not be a bad thing. The lignin content is it's completely non-digestible. So obviously the higher that is, and it's a component of ADF, but the higher that is, the less digestible your hay is going to be. The next thing most people are concerned about, usually they're looking at the carbohydrate variables. And we've got ethanol-soluble carbohydrates. Literally, that term just means in a lab, those carbohydrates are extracted in ethanol. But on a label, that's sugar. Water-soluble carbohydrates, i.e. it's extracted in water in a lab, that's sugar plus another fraction called fructan. And fructan is a carbohydrate that we find in cool season grasses. We're not going to find it in warm season grasses, which primarily store their energy as starches. And the term non-structural carbohydrates, which we're not going to see on our feed tags anymore or on bagged forage products, but it's still a term that horse owners are familiar with, because veterinarians will say, and nutritionists, we all say, if you have a sick horse, they should be eating 10% or less non-structural carbohydrates. That value, when we're talking about forages, is water-soluble carbohydrates plus starch. I'll look at the digestible energy value because that's going to give me an idea of the calorie content. You know, a higher digestible energy value I'm going to want for brood mares or high performance horses or older horses that need to gain weight. Protein content, again, I'm looking for more elevated quality protein content for young growing horses, for mares during lactation, and our performance horses. As I mentioned, grass hays out in the West, they're probably not ever going to be lower than 8% crude protein. Here in the East, I have seen crude proteins on local grass hays down to 5-6%. It's a little more than feed through bedding. Your mixed hay, a legume grass mix, it's going to have a little slightly higher protein content, probably run between 12 and 16%. And your alfalfa hay, especially in the West, that's going to be greater than 16%. And along with that, in alfalfa, it's also, not only is it higher in protein, but it's really good quality protein. And when I say good quality protein, it's high in that amino acid lysine, which is really critical for lactating mares and young growing horses. Forages are not a high source of fat, so it's forage sources, hay samples, it's always going to be less than 3%. So what are you going to get out of alfalfa? I mentioned it's higher in protein and energy, it's higher in calcium, moderate protein, moderate fiber content, lower in starches and sugars. So a lot of people will lean towards this if they have a horse that has some metabolic issues, as long as it's not also morbidly obese. Timothy grass, moderate protein and energy, lower mineral content, much higher fiber content, but that really is determined by the stage of maturity. Now, if we see a lot of seed heads, then it's going to be higher fiber. Low starch, because grasses don't store their energy as starch, but can have pretty high water-soluble and ethanol-soluble carbohydrates, depending, again, on the growing conditions. You can't just blanket say all Timothy and all orchard grass is very high in sugars and starches. It all depends on the growing conditions. Orchard grass, again, moderate protein and energy, high in fiber, lower in starch because we don't store starch in grasses, in cool season grasses, and then higher in our sugars, water-soluble carbohydrates and ethanol-soluble carbohydrates, typically higher in nutrient value compared to Timothy. Now, there's different forms of hay. We can have conventional bales, big bales, compressed bales, hay cubes, hay pellets, chopped hay, but these do not change the digestibility. It literally just changes the physical form, but it doesn't change the digestibility. When we use what I truly consider a hay alternative, something like beet pulp shreds or soy hulls, they are more digestible than your hay pellets. If we look at the non-structural carbohydrate content also, your beet pulp and soy hull is going to be much lower in sugars and starches. So what is good quality forage? Tiffany said we need to talk to people about how to choose the right hay for their horse. And so what is good quality? Is it green, leafy, high nutritional value? Well, I'll get back to that. What is bad quality? Bad quality, it doesn't matter what kind of horse you have, it's always the same. Dirt, dust, mold, weeds, strings, dead animals, any kind of contaminant in that hay is always bad quality hay. Let's go back to what is good quality. We have to talk about what horse do you have? Do you have a lactating broodmare that has very high nutritional demand? She needs a lot of protein. She needs a lot of energy. She puts everything into that baby. It's hard to maintain body weight. I need to maintain body weight because I want to rebreed her. Do you have a 3-day event horse? Again, they have a high calorie content requirement to maintain stamina and energy? Or do you have a laminitic pony who is an 8 on a body condition score and we're just trying to get some weight off him, or any other easy keeper? So good quality comes down to what's appropriate for your horse. If you're at a boarding stable and they have what I will consider a lower nutritional value, maybe a local grass hay, it's actually easier for a boarding stable because they can feed every horse with that, because you can always add. You can select a feed to complement that hay to give every horse in the barn what they need. If you go in and you have alfalfa is all you have, and you have a boarding stable full of obese ponies, then it's probably not going to be the easiest thing to feed the horses that. They'll be eating 2 flakes a day and getting gastric ulcers. I want to show you this really quickly, because if you don't feed enough forage to your horses, whether it be hay or fiber in general, horses are smart and sometimes we're not. And I want to show you in one research study what horses did when they didn't get enough fiber in the diet. So they had 36 horses and they're about 3 years old, and they broke them into 2 groups, high fiber and low fiber, HF and LF, right? The HF group is represented in the gray bars, the dark gray bars, and the low fiber group is represented in the white bars. So I want to go all the way to the end of the graph. It's not the way you really read a graph, but this is the way we're going to do it. We're going to go all the way to the end of the graph and look at those 2 bars. And the words underneath those 2 bars are eating total. So the total amount of time that both groups were observed eating, not eating what you gave them, just eating anything, was about the same. There's no difference, no statistical difference. They spent the same amount of time chewing on something in that stall. We'll come back to the beginning of the graph now. In the first 2 bars, that is eating the ration total. So that's eating what we provided them. The horses that got a lot of hay and only a little bit of grain concentrate, they spent more time actually chewing on that. Well, that makes sense because it takes a long time to chew hay. And the horses that got not much hay, but they got a lot of concentrate, well, that's pretty quick to chew on, so they spent less time eating what was provided to them by the researchers. So that begs the question, what on earth was the difference? What else were the horses eating so that the total amount of time observed chewing something was the same? And it turned out that the horses that didn't get enough hay, that were on a low hay diet, a low forage diet, they ate more bedding and feces, which that's just gross. We don't want our horses to be eating the bedding. We're going to increase our risk for impaction colic and disease and worms, parasites. So the horses were craving fiber, and they will get fiber even if owners don't supply it to them. They'll chew fences, they'll eat trees, they'll eat bedding because they're craving that fiber. So that's just a little tidbit there. So how much hay? How much hay do you need? If I do the 2% of body weight, all right, that's right there in between the 1.5 to 2.5% of body weight. For a 1,000-pound horse, that's 20 pounds a day. Over 2 months, which is 60 days, we're looking at about 1/2 ton per horse in hay. But over 4 months, because that's more typical of winter, we're looking at 120 days, and we're looking at close to 1.5 tons of hay that we need per horse. That can be a little daunting, and it's why we need to be looking for really good hay sources early on, but maybe I don't have the room to store it. So then using what we call, hay pellets, hay cubes, or forage alternatives, adding beet pulp, using highly feeds during the wintertime that are higher in fiber content, maybe during the spring and summer and fall, your horses are on a lower fiber, lower intake feed, but in the wintertime, we can bump them up to something that's got a little more calories and more fiber content to supplement the fiber that they require. So we've kind of gone around the block on a lot of different topics tonight. Main thing with weaning is to decrease stress. Do whatever you can to decrease stress. And, we talk a lot about nutrition, and that is one of the big things that you can do. Get them on a really healthy, balanced diet prior to weaning. Get them really healthy. take care of all of the other requirements, vaccinations, all that prior to weaning. And then choose a weaning strategy that suits your facility and your program. What is a true senior horse? To me, it has poor dentition. Anything that can still chew hay can literally eat any feed that is appropriate for it in the book of feeds. Forage is key. It doesn't matter whether you've got foals, weanlings, yearlings, senior horses. Forage is the most important part of the horse's diet. And then we're going to use a feed to complement that forage. What is it going to affect the forage? Growth stage affects fiber content, digestibility. Fiber content affects digestibility and palatability. But there are different sources that we can get that fiber from, whether it's we're feeding a senior feed that's high in fiber, or Showtime, or something that's higher in fiber content. Adding beet pulp, alfalfa cubes, alfalfa pellets, pelleted sources of fiber. So there's lots of different ways that that are a little more, that can be more convenient, can be easier to store that large quantity of fiber. But no matter how you have to get it, it's absolutely critical to give it to your horse. Fiber is really important. So with that, I will take any questions.